Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Teresa Somrak. I'm the Office and Events Coordinator for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, and I will be moderating today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since 2000. Periodically, we team up with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, PBOT, to bring you special editions featuring guest speakers from PBOT. These seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's campus, but because of COVID-19 pandemic situation, we will be doing this fully online. Today's seminar is part 2 of a 2-part series on Vision Zero. We are pleased to have Matt Kelly speak about how safe speeds save lives, how Portland is managing speeds for safety. Matt Kelly has served as a Vision Zero specialist at the Bureau of Transportation in Portland, Oregon since 2015. He has 2 master's degrees from the University of Michigan in urban planning and in communications. Before jumping into today's seminar, I'd like to let you know, here's a nice picture of Matt. I'd like to let you know about our next Friday seminar. It's going to be with John MacArthur and Aaron Gala, and they'll be presenting on understanding technology-based exclusion in emerging smart mobility systems. You can see our full list of events at trek.pdx.edu/events. An overview of today's seminar. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Before we go ahead and jump in, I'll let you know that Matt will present for about 45 minutes, and then that'll be followed by about 15-minute Q&A. I'll be receiving questions through the questions pane on your control panel, so make sure you know where that is. And I'll save questions till the end and ask Matt after his presentation. If we run out of time to answer all your questions, we will give Matt the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. And we will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today. You'll also receive the video recording and presentation slides and an email following the webinar in the next day or 2. If you're tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Matt here.
All right, thanks Teresa, and thanks TREC for having me today. So I'm really glad that so many people are interested in this topic of speed. And before I get started, I just want to put it out there and be clear that even though I'll be talking about how Portland is, sorry, can you hear me? It sounds like I was muted there for a second, but I'm going to assume everything is okay. So even though I'll be talking about how Portland is managing speeds for safety, we still have a lot of work to do in Portland to help people travel at safe speeds. And so I just want to be clear, this isn't a mission accomplished moment for us. With that said, I think we can be proud of the work we're doing. And I hope some of what I share today is helpful in supporting safe speeds in other places. So let's get started. The photo you see here on this slide is actually not the type of street I'll be focusing on today. In general, we see our most dangerous speeds and worst crashes on multi-lane arterial streets, not local residential streets like in this photo. But I still like this photo because it shows one of the rare street segments in Portland with a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit that includes guidance for sharing the street. So here's what I'd like to cover. First, I'll briefly touch on a few challenges to safe speeds that I think most of us are grappling with, at least in the US. The risks associated with speed have been known for a long time. It's basic physics, but in some ways, the speed-related safety issues on our streets have only gotten worse over past decades, due in part to how vehicles have changed and the degree to which speed or mobility have become embedded in our policies and designs. Next, I'll share some of the work we're doing to manage speeds in Portland. Of the items on this list, I'll spend most of the time on left turn calming, which reduces speeds at intersections to address pedestrian crashes. we're just finishing an evaluation of a pilot project, so I can share some of the findings from that. And last, I'll briefly mention a few things we expect to focus on in coming months to better manage speeds. And one thing I won't discuss specifically is how speeds have changed during the pandemic. I know there's been a lot of discussion about that already, including a panel that NACTA hosted a couple of weeks ago, so I would recommend that. And hopefully, finally, we'll have questions at the end. I'll be sharing a lot of photos today because I know webinars can be hard to pay attention to, at least for myself. I often end up checking email or looking at Twitter or something I shouldn't be doing. I also know that webinars can be pretty impersonal, so I'll start off by sharing one quick thing about myself. The first is that I grew up in rural Michigan, where my parents were dairy farmers, and all the streets near us were unpaved gravel roads, and we didn't have a lot of neighbors. The car you see here is a 1995 Ford Escort, which is the vehicle I drove when I was in high school. And I mention this part because I'll be criticizing cars and trucks today, but I don't hate cars or trucks. I grew up in a place where they were the only way to get around and where people use pickup trucks and other bigger vehicles as a critical tool for getting work done. And so that's enough about me. Switching gears, like many other cities, Portland has a Vision Zero goal to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries. And as I suspect most people watching know, the fundamental idea behind Vision Zero is to create a transportation system that assumes people will continue to make mistakes and will get in crashes, and that we need to use all the tools at our disposal and create layers of redundancies to prevent those crashes from being very serious. And safe speeds are a key part of that work. We've known about the risks of higher speeds for a long time. What you see here is an excerpt from a driving manual published in 1939. I happen to have a physical copy at my office, and it includes some very direct language about the risks of speed. One thing it includes is this illustration showing a car driving off a building of different heights, with taller buildings representing higher speeds from 20 miles per hour at the low end to 60 at the high end. And the text along it says, destructiveness increases with speed. Obviously, top speeds can be quite a bit higher today, but the concept is pretty much the same. And so if you fast forward 79 years to today, we're basically telling people the same thing. This is a graphic we use pretty frequently here in Portland. I'm sure you've all seen similar versions of this. And we have a lot more studies today on the impact of speed on safety than we did 79 years ago, but the messaging is pretty similar. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually really like this graphic, and I do think it's important to continue to emphasize this type of information. In some ways, our messaging about speed does look like a success. This is recent data from a survey that sampled 400 people in Portland. And when you ask people about speed, they will tell you they understand the relationship between speed and risk of death or serious injury. But when you look at what's actually happening on our streets, there's a disconnect. The Governor's Highway Safety Association put out a report earlier this year that said, in very blunt terms, that collectively we've failed to manage speeds on our streets, and people are dying and suffering serious injuries as a result. And other organizations have made similar conclusions. This is a graphic from that same report highlighting our lack of progress since at least 2001. For the sake of time, I won't get into Portland-specific data here, other than to say that speed is a top factor in the serious crashes we see here on our streets locally. One of the biggest challenges we face is the types of vehicles on our streets. They're both bigger and more powerful than they used to be. The graph on the right shows the breakdown of vehicle types produced from 1974 through 2018 for the US market. The dotted line shows the proportion of those which are cars and which are trucks. You can see the label on the right side of the slide. Trucks include certain types of SUVs along with vans and pickups. And for the first time in 2018, vehicles in the truck category overtook cars on the US market. This is a pickup truck that's on the extreme end of what we're seeing on our streets. This was parked just near our office in downtown Portland last summer. But vehicles like this do give you a flavor for the direction things have been heading for a while. The front end of this particular truck is nearly as high as the vehicle in front of it. We know based on research that this type of front end design is much deadlier in crashes, both to people inside smaller vehicles and to people outside a vehicle. This is a smaller vehicle that was recently parked outside my apartment building. It still has the off-road types of features that are characteristic of the truck category. And just here's another example of a larger truck. And I should make it clear, my intention with showing these vehicles isn't to shame anyone who has bought them or to blame their owners personally for the speed issues on our streets. The reality is that these vehicles have big implications for safety, including specifically for speed, for what's happening on our streets. So we need to be aware of that and to make sure we're doing what we can at a city level to account for this. Since 1975, the vehicles on our streets haven't changed much in their overall weight, as you can see in the chart on the left, but they've gained a lot of horsepower, as the chart on the right shows. This increase in horsepower for the same amount of weight is associated with higher travel speeds and greater likelihood to exceed speed limits. This makes sense intuitively, I think. It's something I also hear when I talk to people here in Portland. I remember a phone call I had back in 2018 with a person who was upset when we lowered speed limits on our residential streets to 20 miles per hour. She had recently retired and, as a gift to herself, gotten some type of sporty, higher powered vehicle. And she claimed it was almost impossible to drive it at 20 miles per hour, that she barely had to touch the accelerator to exceed that speed. And I've heard similar things from other people. And they might be exaggerating a bit, but what they're saying is essentially backed up by what's on this slide, that when we're driving more powerful vehicles, we do just tend to go faster, even if we don't consciously intend to. The safety impacts of these vehicles are different for different people. If you're in a vehicle, you're obviously better off in a crash, especially if you're in an SUV or a pickup truck. If you're outside a vehicle, the increased size and power of the vehicles on our streets today puts you at even greater risk than in the past. Here in Portland, we know that people who typically walk, bike, or use transit to get to work tend to have lower incomes. People who use these travel modes are all more vulnerable to the risks associated with more powerful vehicles because people tend to drive faster in those vehicles. And as we know, higher speeds sharply increase the risk of death or serious injury in crashes involving vulnerable road users. In addition to having more powerful vehicles on our streets, we're also grappling with all sorts of broader issues that may lead people to drive at high-risk speeds. For example, we know that we tend to think of our own driving skills as better than average, so we may be more likely to think we have the skills to handle higher speeds. Sometimes people are really upfront about this. I recently read a crash report here where someone was cited for crashing into a person on a bike, and the report quoted that person as saying, "I'm a really good driver though." We've also crafted all sorts of policies and rules that tend to push driving speeds higher. Many of you are probably familiar with how we generally set speed limits in the US, where we essentially raise speed limits when enough people exceed them, which over time can result in higher and higher speed limits. We also tend to give people a lot of leeway in our enforcement of speed limits. Sometimes we're even explicit about it. That arrow at the bottom points to an excerpt from a recent Oregon state law, which says that people have to exceed a speed limit by at least 11 miles per hour in order to receive a speeding citation from a camera that's also capable of detecting red light violations. As a city, we don't control all these factors that can lead to high-risk speeds. We don't control vehicle designs. We can't just tell people they aren't as good a driver as they think they are. We don't set state law, but we do control our street designs for the most part. And here in Portland, we see most of our serious crashes on streets that look like this one. These streets encourage higher driving speeds. They have multiple lanes in each direction, long distances between signals, and a wide open look and feel that effectively tells drivers this is a place to go fast. People traveling outside vehicles on these multi-lane streets are really vulnerable. You can see it just by looking at photos like this. And this is an intersection near a light rail station in Portland that gets a lot of foot traffic. When you add everything up, the more powerful vehicles, our own biases about our driving skills, our laws and rules that facilitate higher speeds, some of our street designs, it shouldn't be a surprise that we get a lot of crashes. And most of them result only in property damage like this one, but we know that's not always the case. The person driving this vehicle hit one of our bus shelters a few years ago, and no one was hurt in that crash, luckily. And this is a pedestrian refuge island on one of our multi-lane arterial streets. We often have to repair the rapid flashing beacons at these locations as a result of crashes. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do to manage speeds on our streets. I'll spend the rest of the time today talking about some of what we've been doing, starting with a pilot project to slow speeds at intersections. In Portland, we are lucky to have a dedicated crash data analyst, Ana Maria Perez, who helps us identify some of the biggest safety issues on our streets. And she actually gave a truck presentation just a couple of weeks ago about her work. One thing our crash data tells us is that we're seeing a lot of pedestrian crashes at intersections with signals, nearly half. And one intersection movement in particular stands out. A full 20% of pedestrian crashes in Portland occur when a driver turns left at a signalized intersection and collides with someone in a crosswalk. Some of these left turn crashes are very serious, including this one in 2018 that resulted in the death of an older man. Some of these left turn crashes involve people on bikes, including one in 2015 where a person driving made a left turn that resulted in serious injuries to a person on a bike. To help address these crashes, we've started installing rubber bumps or delineators at intersections to slow turning speeds. We put them on the center line on the street people are turning onto, where there are traffic signals that allow permissive left turns. This is something New York City started doing a few years ago and that other cities, including Washington, D.C., are now doing as well. And so to understand the effects of this, we piloted this treatment at 42 intersections starting last year with a relatively small budget and with a goal of answering two basic questions. Does it help safety, and how much maintenance does it require? Our pilot project essentially had 4 treatment groups. At certain locations, we installed a nose that extended into the intersection, which is what is circled in the middle diagram on the previous slide. So the nose is what's in that middle diagram in the circle. Other locations did not include a nose. We also used 2 different materials. Some locations use delineators on the center line, while others use only these small rubber speed bumps, similar to what you'd see in a parking garage. We also installed bumps on some corners to help slow turning speeds, called a wedge. The diagram on the left shows a top-down view of a work order for our crews when they were installing a wedge. This happens to be where a one-way street meets another one-way street. The photo on the right shows the finished installation. This is one of our pilot intersections before installing turn calming. And this is the same intersection with turn calming installed. You can see that we also upgraded the crosswalk to high visibility markings. On the far side of the intersection, we used delineators to extend a pre-existing concrete curb that was installed for access management at that Walgreens. Here's another pilot location before turn calming. And here's what it looks like with turn calming installed. In this case, we added a nose that extends into the intersection. And on these slides, I should mention what you see in parentheses is the approximate cost of installing these materials. It includes the material cost as well as the labor cost of getting them in there. And I just decided to include that just because I think it's helpful sometimes to be pretty upfront about what things are costing. And in part because what we want with this treatment is something that we can do relatively quickly and cheaply. This is another example. This is one of our larger intersections on a multi-lane arterial street. In this case, we use delineators along the center line. This is at an intersection on one of our main routes for people biking, and it has a history of right turn crashes. Most of our wedges use bumps, but in this case, we use delineators to increase their visibility and to mitigate conflicts with people biking. We evaluated the effect of these treatments by measuring turning speeds before and after installation. We found small but consistent reductions in speed. The graph on the right showed that locations that included a nose were more effective than locations without a nose, with an average of 16% reductions in median speeds across locations with a nose, compared to 10% without. While these are relatively small reductions in speed, we know that even slight reductions in speed can have a large impact on safety. The graph on the bottom left shows the relationship between vehicle impact speeds and the risk of death to pedestrians. Our data does show that noses that extend into the intersection bring down speeds a little more than without, but we can't always fit them. And so this is an example of an intersection where if we put the noses where those red X's are, they would be directly in the path of people biking, which is shown in the yellow arrows. And our intention with this is not to send people over these bumps, especially people on bikes. In addition to measuring speeds, we looked at the effect of this treatment on the angle at which people turn. The graph at the top right shows that all 4 treatment groups essentially eliminated instances of people crossing the center line when making turns, which may increase the chance that when we're able to prevent that movement, it should decrease the chance that a pedestrian is blocked by a vehicle's A-pillar, which is shown in the photos along the bottom. We would prefer that people turn so they can more directly face a crosswalk at more of a right angle so that the A-pillar isn't blocking their view as much. The next 4 slides are basically stills captured from a video, and they show what an ideal turn would look like where we had this installed. This shows someone making a left turn where we have left turn calming in place, and they are just starting to make their turn here. They come close to hitting the nose, but mostly avoid it. And at this point, the driver is almost directly facing the crosswalk, which should give them a good view of any people that were there. And then they complete their turn with the vehicle protruding just a little bit into that outside lane. We also looked at maintenance costs as part of the pilot project. Not surprisingly, we had to replace some of the delineators. This photo shows an example where we had a section of tough curb where 4 delineators were dislodged, which we had to replace. The rubber bumps haven't required any maintenance up to this point. We haven't had a chance to see how they withstand snowplows yet. We didn't have enough snow in Portland last winter. New York City staff used the same product for the bumps, and they found that the bumps withstand snowplows fairly well, but this is something we'll have to continue to monitor. The public reaction to left turn calming has been pretty quiet. We didn't survey people, but we did do a fair amount of social media outreach and emails to let people know what the purpose of these treatments is. We also provided contact information for people to let us know about any issues or suggestions. The photo at left is a screenshot of a Twitter comment, which makes it clear that the purpose of this design isn't obvious. We don't necessarily see that as a problem if we're seeing better safety outcomes, though. We don't have crash data yet, but New York has found reductions in pedestrian crashes where they've installed turn calming. And a recent study from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety concluded that left turn calming has improved intersection safety in Washington, D.C. We've wrapped up our pilot at this point, and we'll be likely to continue installing left turn calming at more intersections. We'll be posting our full evaluation report online within the next week or 2. So at this point, I'm going to shift gears into some of the other ways we're managing speeds. And one way is pretty simple. It's updating speed limits across Portland. Since 2017, we've lowered speed limits on more than 130 miles of major streets, as well as reduced all our local residential streets from 25 to 20 miles per hour. Our goal is to post nearly all streets no higher than 30 miles per hour, with some exceptions for streets that have features like full access management or fully separated facilities for vulnerable road users. We know that speed limits don't fully address safety issues related to speed, but we see speed limits as an important part of an overall package of speed management tools. Speed limits set clear expectations both for the public and for our own staff about the speeds we should be aiming for. For the most part, we've gone ahead and reduced speed limits even when we don't have other changes lined up, such as road diets or signal timing updates. This has allowed us to move pretty quickly in getting these speed limits updated, but we know there's more work to do at many locations where we've lowered speed limits. I won't get into the process through which we set speed limits. In Oregon, it's a complicated system that's regulated at the state level. In terms of our philosophy, though, we're striving to set speed limits based on a safe system approach, where speed limits reflect likely crash types, resulting impact forces, and our own body's ability to withstand those forces. I've already mentioned the standard approach that heavily weighs 85th percentile speeds. The next few slides show where we've recently reduced speed limits on major streets in Portland. So this is 2017, this is 2018, 2019, and here's all of them except for all the local residential streets we reduced to 20 miles per hour in 2018. The pink zone in the middle basically covers Portland's downtown, where nearly all streets at this point, including arterials, have 20 mile per hour speed limits. We don't have enough crash data yet to assess the impact of these speed limit reductions on crashes. In terms of travel speeds, we're evaluating what effect our residential speed limit reduction had, and we should have results available to share very soon. We haven't systematically evaluated the effect of speed limit reductions on our major streets, but some smaller one-off evaluations do indicate we're seeing slower speeds, at least in some cases. The table on the slide shows before and after data from one of our collector streets in a residential area in Portland, where we reduced the speed limit from 30 to 25 miles per hour on a segment of it. Based on our data, we're seeing lower 85th percentile speeds and a reduction in the proportion of people driving 35 miles per hour or more. One way we're helping to enforce speed limits in Portland is using automated cameras that are fixed in place. We have 8 of these cameras at this point in Portland. There's one in each direction on 4 of our most dangerous arterial streets. The locations of these cameras are not a secret. We actually want people to be aware of them because our goal is to slow people down, not give out tickets. This photo shows what people driving see before each of the cameras. And all these signs are posted far enough ahead of the cameras so that people have a chance to slow down before being photographed. In addition, people who use any kind of navigation app on their phone get an alert warning them about these cameras. And before a citation is issued, it's reviewed independently by 2 police officers. We also offer a traffic safety class instead of a citation, depending on people's driving record. The photo on the left shows another approach to a camera, while the photo on the right shows the camera equipment itself. We installed our first speed safety cameras in 2016 after working successfully with our state legislature to legalize them. The state legislation requires us to submit annual reports about the cameras, so we have a lot of data about them. And I just pulled these graphs from one of those reports to our legislature. The graph on the left shows the proportion of people speeding at each camera location before and after these cameras started operating. The graph on the right shows the proportion of people driving 10 miles per hour or more above the speed limit before and after the cameras. In both cases, we're seeing sharp reductions, which is a good indication that these streets are now safer than they were before. This table shows the effect of the cameras on 85th percentile speeds, which have decreased in all cases. But the thing I actually want to point out here is that we've continued reducing speed limits even where we do have cameras installed. And so we've done this on 2 of the 4 streets we have cameras at this point, and we expect to do so relatively soon on the other 2, which are still posted at 40 and 35 miles per hour. Again, we generally want to get speed limits down to 30 miles per hour or lower, and you can see we're not there yet. When we do reduce speed limits where we have cameras installed, we put out media alerts to help let people know, and we stop issuing citations for 2 weeks after reducing the speed limit to give people a chance to adjust their speeds. Because again, we don't want to be giving out tickets, we just want that behavior change. Right now, we're working through a process to expand our speed safety cameras to more locations. This isn't as simple as simply looking at crash data and plopping them down, though. We know there are concerns in our community about putting more cameras where people may already experience a lot of negative effects from our criminal justice system, including from our traffic enforcement. So we are looking at crash data, but we're also looking to ensure we are spreading these cameras out geographically to help mitigate those concerns. The trick is that many of our most vulnerable community members also live in places that see a lot of our serious crashes. So there's a tension between getting these cameras where they are most needed from a traffic safety perspective, while also being sensitive to over-enforcement concerns. We also continue to support changes at our local and state level to help reduce the burden of traffic enforcement on vulnerable individuals. These changes include things like expanding options for diversion, increasing access to payment plans, and reducing fine amounts for lower income individuals. Some of these changes are really difficult politically, but we see support for them as an important part of our Vision Zero work. I want to touch briefly on the education and outreach we do related to safe speeds. As anyone who works in a public agency may know, it can be hard to justify spending our limited funds on education. People can be skeptical that it's worth the money, and I'm actually sympathetic to that, because it can be hard to know what effect, if any, the education and outreach we do has on people's behavior. And partly that's because we sometimes just don't evaluate our own work very well. With that said, I think we ignore education at our peril, because we need some public level of understanding and acceptance for our work to support safe speeds. I won't get into the research on traffic safety campaigns, except to point to this World Health Organization excerpt that I think does a nice job distilling key points. In particular, I think that third bullet is important, because sometimes supporting safe speeds means doing some very disruptive things, whether that's adding more enforcement cameras or reducing space for cars on our streets. The next few slides are just some examples of our messaging work here in Portland. Again, I'm not going to get into the details here, I just want to provide a flavor. This is a simple message we put on billboards and various other places last year. There were a few variations on this theme. Here's a similar message on a yard sign, and of course, using children to spread traffic safety messaging is never a bad thing. More examples. Here, the photo on the left shows a yard sign we handed out in 2018 to support our 20-mile-per-hour residential speed limit reductions. These yard signs were very popular. We ended up distributing more than 7,000 of them and continue to get requests today. This is from a messaging campaign in 2017 that focused specifically on speed. The same campaign used short videos we posted on social media. So this is another variation and another example. This photo shows something a little different. Starting last year, we began putting variable message signs at locations of deadly crashes. We leave these in place for about 2 weeks. The signs alternate between two messages: travel with care, and then traffic death with the date of the crash. These aren't exactly a messaging campaign, but we see them as another way to raise awareness of the impact of traffic violence in our city. Very few people actually see a serious crash unless they catch something on local news, because we clean them up very fast and we get those repairs done. And before you know it, things look no different. These signs provide a reminder, at least for a little while, that something very tragic happened. We can't say exactly how effective our messaging campaigns are, but we have some data that's at least promising. All the numbers on this slide are from scientifically sampled weighted surveys from the last few years, so they should be fairly representative of people in Portland. I want to bring particular attention to that last bullet that's in bold about speed safety cameras, because we know that automated enforcement can be controversial and is heavily restricted or entirely forbidden in some places. Having 75% of people in Portland support our cameras is a good sign that there is some level of trust that we are using this tool responsibly to make our streets safer, which is important given that we want to continue using them. So I'm starting to get to the end here. I have a few slides left, and they're all about street designs that we've recently completed that have reduced high-risk speeds. We know that street design plays an important role in the speed that people travel on our streets. Last year, we made some major changes to some of our biggest, highest crash streets in Portland. The three examples I'm going to show all involve projects where we repurpose space to provide one general purpose lane instead of two in each direction. So what you're seeing on this slide is what used to be a 5-lane street that also included parking. Now it has 3 lanes for driving and 2 lanes for biking, plus it still has parking on both sides. And one advantage of this design is that it makes it much easier and cheaper for us to install crosswalks that meet our safety guidelines. Under the previous cross-section, we would not have installed a crosswalk unless it had rapid flashing beacons or a signal, which is much more expensive. The photo shows a temporary crosswalk that we will be hardening with concrete and permanent signage this summer. This is a more traditional 4-to-3 road diet that reorganized the space to create a center turn lane and parking protected bike lanes. The parking protected area is mostly unparked at this point, so it's maybe a little confusing, but basically all that striping is designed to indicate where people should park. This is another 5-to-3 project on a multi-lane arterial street, showing the street before we made changes. And this is what the same street looks like now. The before and after photos are at slightly different locations, but it is the same street. You can see that we reorganized the space to create parking protected bike lanes with one general purpose travel lane in each direction. For each one of these projects, we've seen a sharp reduction in the proportion of people driving 10 miles per hour or more above the speed limit, which is a good indication that conditions are safer on those streets. Each one of those projects is a little different, but one thing they all have in common is that they reorganize the streets so that there is one lane in each direction for driving instead of 2. That gives people driving a much better ability to set the pace of travel because there's no longer an opportunity for people, at least legally, to pass another driver. These tables show more of the data behind the graph on the previous slide. Really what I want to point out here, though, is that even though people now have 2 instead of 4 through lanes for driving, each one of those streets is seeing about the same overall traffic volumes, at least before the current coronavirus outbreak. That's a good indication that these streets are still working, at least fairly well, in terms of travel time for people driving, and that we likely aren't creating a lot of diversion onto side streets, which is always a concern for people when we do these types of projects. There's obviously a lot of other street design issues we could discuss related to speed, but I'll just briefly mention the traffic calming work we do on our smaller streets. Mostly I'm talking about speed bumps or speed cushions when using that term. Traffic calming is hugely popular in Portland, and we constantly get requests for speed bumps or other tools to reduce traffic volumes or speeds. There are a lot of people out there who want fewer people driving on their street, and they want people driving more slowly on their street. And, ideally, we would be able to say yes to all these requests. We have, limited funding, and so we do have to prioritize, and we do that in essentially 2 ways. We funnel resources into streets that serve as primary routes for kids and parents walking and biking to school through our Safe Routes to School program. And we put traffic calming on our streets that serve as neighborhood greenways, which prioritize people walking and biking. One outcome of this is that we basically do not do any traffic calming based on emails and phone calls from the public. And that's a really tough thing, and I hope we'll be able to get to yes to more people in the future. But I would say one upshot is that our process does give us some protection against a system in which the loudest, best connected people get the most resources. It's not a perfect system by any means, but from an equity perspective, I think this is an important point to make. In terms of next steps for speed management in Portland, we're looking at a few things. One project we're just starting to work on is looking at how we can better prevent people from using center turn lanes as through lanes. And so what we're looking to do is use a little bit of striping and tough curb or the plastic curbing to do this relatively quickly and cheaply on some of our multi-lane arterial streets. And so what you're seeing on this slide is a concept of what this may end up looking like. We also know there's more work we can do to retime our signals to support safer speeds, especially where we've lowered speed limits. So we'll be continuing to look at that. We're also continuing to work on getting our speed limits down, especially on our larger arterial streets. And we're also, as I mentioned, working to expand our speed safety cameras. So hopefully at this point, the takeaways from this presentation are clear by now. I'm very proud of the work we're doing in Portland. At the same time, we know we still have a lot to do. And so I'm just going to end by thanking Trek and my colleagues at the Portland Bureau of Transportation and all the Portland community members who I know support safer speeds on our streets. And I know I was supposed to go for about 45 minutes, and I think I'm a little short of that. So, but that's what I have today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I will be asking you some questions here. So first one looks like where you have reduced posted speeds, looks like 85% speeds were reduced. What about top end dangerous speeds like 10 and above miles per hour over posted?
Yeah, and so that's a great question because those are the speeds that we are most concerned about. When I was sharing, I think the only thing I really shared in this presentation was some data from one of our collector streets. And, you know, frankly, we just haven't done a systematic evaluation of what effects our speed limits have had on actual travel speeds at this point. We are working on our residential street speed limit evaluation to look at 25 to 20. But in terms of those top end speeds on some of these major streets, that's something we still need to look at more closely. So I don't have the data in front of me, unfortunately.
Okay. Does PBOT use Bluetooth monitors for measuring speed and checking speed limit compliance?
Yeah, we do some of that. I believe, and this is a little outside my area of expertise, our traffic signals folks are more involved with this. I can say for sure that we do use Bluetooth devices to collect traffic data, but I don't know a whole lot more than that at this point. And again, that's something that as we start to, I think, evaluate more of these speed limit reductions, we'll be looking to see what data we have available, including that type of data.
Great. For camera enforcement, is that program managed by PBOT or by a contractor? What accountability measures are in place to ensure the program targets speeds and not abused for profit?
Yeah, so this is, again, this is a program that I don't work directly on, so a lot of what I'm talking about today, I won't be able to fully answer. With that said, there is a contractor involved with our camera equipment. We don't, you know, as a city, we don't have the ability, this is some pretty technical equipment, so obviously we do have to pay a company to assist in this effort. So yes, there is a contractor involved, and I should say we do work with a Portland Police Bureau on this as well. It's not just a transportation bureau. In terms of those accountability measures, you know, that's something I would have to look into more. I think that's, frankly, I'm very sympathetic to those types of concerns. I understand that people, you know, have concerns about privacy, about just making sure that we're not abusing these cameras, and but I don't have those details in front of me.
Great. We have a question about these bumps. Do the rubber bumps with noses impact crosswalk and ADA compliance? Are they, let's see, are they called out in the manual on uniform traffic control devices? And if not, do you have an interim approval from the Federal Highway Administration?
Yeah, so the first question about ADA accessibility, all these materials are located outside of crosswalks. So even though they're in some cases they get close to the crosswalk, they're always outside of the path of a crosswalk. So my understanding is there shouldn't be any ADA issues there, but we have people on our team that that look at that type of thing. In terms of whether this is compliant with some of those standards you mentioned. Again, our traffic engineers, they have more expertise in this than I do, but my understanding is that given the material that we're using and that we're not actually changing how people can legally use the street, we're just kind of guiding that. With my understanding, at least, is that we don't need any kind of even interim approval to do this type of thing.
Great. What factors has PBOT used to help determine the selection of delineated devices? Bollards, paint, raised plastic, etc.
Yeah, so our maintenance crews have a lot of experience using all kinds of materials. So to the extent we could use things that they were already familiar with and had tested, we just went with that. We were trying to minimize the extent to which we were experimenting. So in terms of the delineators, we use a product called Tough Curb XLP, I believe is the name. And that's something that our maintenance crews recommended just based on our experience here. We've installed quite a few kind of delineator posts in Portland at this point, and so we have some experience in maintaining them. But even with that said, even the materials that we're using, they're still getting knocked down and they still are kind of a maintenance hassle, which is partly why we were looking with turn calming to see if we could use these bumps instead, because at least based on New York's experience and what we saw with our pilot, they do require a lot less maintenance. And so with those bumps, that was a new material for us. That wasn't something that we had previously stocked or put out on our streets. I think they're basically made for parking lots. They're really, I don't think, even designed necessarily for our streets. We tried two different bump products. We did some testing. We also talked with New York City staff who were very helpful in sharing their experience, and they had done quite a bit of testing themselves. And so we ended up using the same bump product that New York City used, and that's worked pretty well so far.
Great. Do you see an uptake in walking and cycling where speeds have been reduced?
I would love to know that. We unfortunately don't have good data on walking, especially in terms of volumes or direction or where people are walking in Portland. We do have some bike data that we count, but that's also pretty limited. So I think, of course, our hope is that when you are able to bring speeds down, you're increasing not just the safety, but the overall comfort of a street. And so, we would hope that that is making people more comfortable using those on a walk, on their feet or on a bike. But we don't actually have data at this point on that.
Great. Has the Department of Transportation assisted with and encouraged these measures?
Is that kind of like these measures being everything I talked about, or?
I'm thinking, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Specifically, the issues we were most recently talking about with the bumps.
And that's about our state Department of Transportation at the state level. Was that?
They don't specify. I was thinking federal, but maybe perhaps both.
As far as I know, we have not interacted at a federal or state level on left turn calming at all. I think this has really been, for us at least, a pretty city to city kind of transaction where, again, New York City has been super helpful.
Great. How has Portland been able to prioritize safe routes and public greenways? Were there any problems with implementing that?
Yeah, so those are, I went through that very quickly, but in Portland, we have a Safe Routes to School program that has staff dedicated to it who are, they've done a ton of work to identify where we have safety needs on our streets. And so we have a huge inventory that includes, lots of projects that we've identified that we don't have funding for yet. And so we have basically a huge list that, we can continue to, as we get funding, just pour money into that. And they went through a very extended process to create that list. They talked to people at all our school districts all across Portland and did lots of surveys and open houses. So it was a huge process. And so in terms of our neighborhood greenways, that is, again, that's another program that has a dedicated staff person. And there's been a lot of, over the years, Portland has spent a lot of time on kind of creating a plan for neighborhood greenways. And so, again, that's a program that has been built up over a long period of time. And so that program also has basically a list where we've already identified where we want to get these neighborhood greenways, as well as where we need to solidify ones that already exist, but where people are driving too fast. So I'm not really answering the question there, unfortunately. It's a little too complicated for a quick soundbite.
Great. Most of the emphasis so far has been on retrofits. Has PBOT developed typicals or design parameters for more permanent solutions as part of a large scale reconstruction?
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't really call it out, but whether we're talking about the left turn calming or that center turn lane calming, there are more permanent, more solid solutions to those same issues. And so I think part of what we've been trying to do with Vision Zero more generally is to speed up some of these interim things, find ways to kind of fill the gaps between big capital projects and things that we can do more quickly. In terms of left turn calming, that isn't necessary where we have a protected left turn signal. So that would be one obvious way to just prevent that conflict from happening in the first place. If you're able to separate the walk phase from the turn phase with a left turn arrow, that resolves that issue. And so we are doing more protected left turns. And so where we have those in place, we shouldn't need any kind of left turn calming. And so, that's another way to resolve that issue. Obviously, anytime we touch our signals, it can be very expensive. And so that's an exponentially more expensive type of intervention. And so turn calming can be a good fit between that. And then there's, I mentioned at the end that idea of center turn lane calming, where we're trying to take up more of that space in the center of the street, especially on bigger streets. The kind of the longer term intervention there would be probably like a center turn median, something that's really built with concrete and that is taking up that space. Again, that involves more of a bigger intervention, and we're talking a lot more money at that point. So I think with these tools, we're trying to find ways to fit that gap. And I would say yes, when we do these big capital projects, these are issues we're looking to solve in a more permanent way.
Great. From which stakeholder groups do you get the most opposition to your safer roads and safer speeds initiatives?
That's a tricky question, because I think there's a huge amount of support for safer speeds on our streets. And I think for a lot of people, it just depends on what street you're talking about. When you're talking about the street people live on, I think it's very popular. Reducing our residential streets from 25 to 20, we didn't do any kind of formal survey, but just based on the feedback that we got, it was, I think, a very popular change for the city. And I think, so when we're talking about some of these bigger streets, that's where I think it's more complicated, because obviously some people still do live on those bigger arterial streets. But for a lot of people, at least a lot of people I think we hear from especially, those are streets that their experience with those streets is in a car, and it's their way to work, or it's, they're trying to get someplace. And so they, I think, maybe a little less sympathetic to some of these interventions. And so, I don't want to call any particular group of people out, because I think for any particular person, it's just gonna depend on what street we're talking about. And so I would just leave it at
that. Maybe somewhat along those lines, what kind of legal or institutional obstacles are there to adding more speed cameras besides the unpopularity?
Yeah, so I think, there are people at our bureau who worked really hard to get authority to put speed cameras on our streets. That was something that we got authority to do only recently, only in 2016. So this is a young program. Since that time, there has been a little bit of an expansion so that other cities can do this too. And at this point, if you look at our state law, our authority to use these cameras is actually due to sunset. It's not even permanent at this point. And so, that's in terms of restrictions, that's really something that that we're concerned about, and so we're working with our legislators to try to address that. And so it's the way our state law works is very complicated. There's a lot of restrictions on where we can put our cameras, but I would say I think we're really hopeful that we're going to be able to expand our cameras and get them in more of our streets. I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Great. Do new urban developments need to include safer road designs to get approval?
Yeah, that's touching on kind of a development review type of question, and unfortunately, I can't speak to that in too much detail. That's we do have people at our bureau that are heavily involved in development review, and we do work with them to do what we can to make sure that any new development comes through is helping bring safety improvements along with that. But that gets into a level of detail that I just can't really speak to with a lot of detail.
Great. Can you talk more about how the parking protected bike lanes are working for Portland? This sounds like it may not be as strictly related. Been resistant to implement them as they seem to be an odd and unexpected configuration that could result in more bike-related collisions.
Yeah, so parking protected bike lanes, I would say, continue to be a challenge, and people do have different opinions about them. I would say even for people who identify as a bicyclist or someone who typically rides a bike, I think there's different opinions about whether they're better than your standard bike lane or not. There is research out there about this issue, and so I would defer to that. But it sounds like partly the question is sort of a public response or community response to this, and I think it's mixed, but it's one of the more inexpensive ways we can get some separation between people biking and people driving. And so, at least from a Vision Zero perspective, where we're looking at that separation as being something that's pretty important to safety, that's still something that we would be inclined to push forward.
Great. And I think that there's a couple existing recorded webinars that kind of cover different bike lane intersection designs too that are available on Trek's website. Let's see, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Is there data showing that speed cameras effects continue much beyond the camera itself physically?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that every time I talk about speed cameras, someone asks that question, and I don't have a good answer at this point. I think that's something that I do want to follow up on with our staff, because I know that that's something people are really interested in. I think we do have data that shows that it does carry at least some distance on either side of the camera, and just anecdotally, we know that even though we try to be really obvious about our cameras, for better or worse, there's some confusion about, we have cameras, like most cities at this point, at all kinds of places. We have cameras, a lot of cameras that are only collecting traffic data, but they're, these little devices strung up at intersections and things. So I think to some extent, there's some confusion about which of those cameras are issuing citations and which of them are just collecting traffic data. And so I guess with all that said, I think, to the extent that people are maybe a little confused about those cameras, or just not really sure about where the the bad cameras are, I think that that could potentially be increasing the extent to which people are watching their speed a little bit more. But unfortunately, I don't have good data for that.
And one last quick question, kind of related. How much is the cost for each of these camera installations?
Yeah, that's something I would have to look into. I know that you know, this is not a program where we're just rolling in money here. I mean, this is really an expense for us. This is not a revenue generating program, and so it is an expense, and you know, but I don't know the level of detail with how the contract works. These are very complicated contracts that go into huge amount of detail that I'm just not sure.
Great. Well, Matt, do you have any last comments or anything you'd like to end on?
I don't think so. I'm so happy that people are interested in this topic, and I feel like I wasn't able to answer a lot of those questions, but if anyone reaches out to me, I'd be happy to do what I can to follow up and get people better answers. I know there's a lot of questions wanting more data and more solid kind of numbers behind a lot of this, and so if people reach out to me, I'd be happy to help try to do what I can with that.
Great. I will send you a list of all the questions that were asked, and so you can get back to people too.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This will conclude our Friday seminar. After I close this, a brief survey is going to pop up, and I'll just take a few minutes for our attendees to fill out. If you could do that, we'd appreciate your feedback. And if you are looking for other professional development offerings, you can visit our website at trek.pdx.edu. I also put the link to Vision Zero on the ending screen here if you want more information on that. And with that, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks again so much, Matt.
Thanks.